Sing it, Curtis. Well, we're not talking about Curtis. We're talking here with my friend, movie historian, and now second-time author, Lou Sabini. And Lou is a dedicated and devoted student of the history of film and a good friend to boot, and just someone who devotes himself to this wonderful craft of old movies, which are they're just so much a part of my culture and so many others. And it's always a treat to have Lou on. And tonight we're going to be talking about Lou's new book, Sex in the Sin-ema, about the pre-code era in Hollywood. And we have Lou. Lou, how are you this evening?
I'm doing great, Tony. How are you?
I am fine, thank you. And I'm really excited about this book. Why don't you tell us how you got started with it and what caused it to come into the fine book that it is?
Okay. Well, that's quite a long story, but I'm willing to let you know what happened. Back in I guess the early 1980s, I was good friends with film historian William K. Everson. And my wife and I used to frequent his apartment in Manhattan, and he had a huge film archive that he owned. And he showed Sue and I two pre-code films, Babyface with Barbara Stanwyck, and the other one was Three on a Match with Ann Dvorak, Betty Davis, and Humphrey Bogart has a small part in it. And well, this is like watching pre-code 101. And I just fell in love with that era. And every time we would visit Bill's apartment, I would ask, I want to see more of these pre-code films because they were so different from anything I had ever seen before. And I guess the next question you're going to ask me is, well, what is pre-code film? And these movies were made before the censorship code came in, the Hays Office. I mean, the Hays Office has been around since 1922. After various scandals like the William Desmond Taylor murder, and also the Fatty Arbuckle, he was accused of raping and murdering Virginia Rapp, and
right.
Also there was another fellow, Wallace Reed, who died of a drug overdose. So the Catholic Church and other civic groups were starting to think that movies were getting a little too raunchy. And so they brought the Catholic Church in, and they wanted to, clean up Hollywood, so to speak. And they did by setting up their own rules. But nobody really listened to these rules until 1934, July of 1934, when they really instituted a strict set of rules, which stayed in existence until around 1967. So these movies that I cover are from 1930 to 1934.
And it's quite an assortment of movies, and we've all seen them. I mean, maybe we haven't. Each one of us hasn't seen every one, but a lot of these movies were the movies that were playing on the independent channels when we were growing up, at least around the New York area.
Well, actually, that's not really so true, because a lot of these films, they weren't allowed to show them when we were growing up. They didn't really hit the TV screens until the 1980s.
Okay.
Because they thought the films were a little too risque for television. So a lot of these were not shown. I mean, yes, you did have movies, the classics like King Kong, although that was cut.
Right.
The Public Enemy with James Cagney. She Done 'Em Wrong and I'm No Angel with Mae West. But many of these other films you really didn't get to see, and they're quite shocking. I mean, it's almost, to describe pre-code, it's almost like being Alice through the looking glass, looking into this abstract world. It doesn't seem like an old movie because there's the subject matter is so mature, and there's this emphasis on sex in pre-code movies, and you'll see what I mean when we start looking at some of the photographs.
And let's start to look at that, and Mike is going to put the first one up here.
Okay.
And this one is kind of interesting. We were looking at it before, and James Cagney in a suit and a young lady in a tub who looks like she doesn't have any clothes on.
Right, that's Joan Blondell, and this is from the 1931 feature Blonde Crazy. which was, it was Cagney's second starring film after The Public Enemy. So Cagney had just made it big. Now, James Cagney and Joan Blondell came to Hollywood together. They were appearing in a Broadway show called Penny Arcade. And apparently, if I get the story right, I believe it was Al Jolson saw the two of them in it. And Jolson was under contract to Warner Brothers. And he brought Cagney and Blondell to Hollywood to appear in the film's version of Penny Arcade. And Cagney, did parts and pictures after that, but it wasn't until The Public Enemy in 1931, where he played criminal Tom Powers, that he became a huge star. That was directed by William Wellman, by the way. But this was their Cagney's second starring film, Blonde Crazy.
It's when you mention The Public Enemy, though, and I'm not going to spoil it for anyone that hasn't seen it, but that last scene is a doozy. It still scares me.
Oh yeah, it's very haunting with Cagney mummified and his corpse just falls at the front doorstep, and his brother sees it. Cagney's just been rubbed out by Patty Ryan's mob.
It's chilling. It's absolutely unbelievable.
Oh, it certainly is.
We're going to go to the next picture.
Okie doke.
And this is Marlene Dietrich, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich came to this country under the influence of Joseph von Sternberg. Sternberg, although he was American-born, he went to Germany and made a movie called Blue Angel with Dietrich, which really catapulted her screen career. And he brought her to America, and together they made a bunch of movies together. This was one of the last. It was called Blonde Venus from 1932. And it stars a very young, Herbert Marshall is in it, but there's a 28-year-old Cary Grant in the film as well. And in this movie...
Off the stilts, yeah.
It's very offbeat. I mean, Dietrich plays a mother. She has a little son, Dickie Moore, of our gang fame. And she's married to Herbert Marshall, who is dying from radium poisoning. And they have no money. So she goes out and prostitutes herself to raise money. And it's quite the film. And for years, by the way, TV prints, they used to show it on television, but the first 5 minutes of the movie with a nude swimming sequence with Marlene Dietrich was edited out. And for years you couldn't see that scene, but now it's been restored on DVD and you can see that sequence.
And 1932 this was?
Yes, this was 1932.
Unbelievable. And it's like whatever visions you have here of the Victorian era and people being prim and proper, well, we're doing away with that tonight, folks.
Right. Well, Marlene Dietrich in this outfit she's wearing, by the way, it's a real bizarre. She does a musical number called Hot Voodoo, and she's dressed for that number in this photograph.
Unbelievable. We're going to go to the next picture while I'm still able to recover from this one. This is amazing. And here's a familiar face from afternoon TV. I believe it's Loretta Young.
Okay, and let me just, Loretta Young, yes, and she's being hooked up by Henry Travers, correct?
Yes.
Okay, this movie was called Born, great title, Born to be Bad, from 1934, and the fellow that's hooking up her dress is Henry Travers. People will remember him as playing Clarence the Angel in the 1946 Frank Capra classic.
Angelic Clarence, shame.
Yes, this is quite different here. But Loretta Young she's at her most beautiful in this film, and this is another one of those sordid tales about this single mother who prostitutes herself to get her son back. He's taken away from her because she hasn't been a good mother, and it's a very racy film. It was directed by Lowell Sherman, and this is one of his last movies that he had directed. He was killed, I believe, in a car accident in 1934 while they were filming the first Technicolor film, Becky Sharp which was released in 1935.
Amazing. Yeah, she was so lovely, Loretta Young. And I mean, it's, I always think of the Loretta Young Theater and, coming down the stairs and whatever the dress happened to be that day.
Yeah. Loretta here, by the way, was only 20 years old, and she had started in movies in the silent era. One movie that's most notable is from 1928 called Laugh, Clown, Laugh, where she co-starred with Lon Chaney, the Man of a Thousand Faces.
It's, and just a classic beauty and a legend.
Oh, yes.
We'll go to the next picture, and this is, I believe, William Powell on the right.
Okay.
It sure looks like him. And he's, it's a man and a woman, and they're, the woman is holding a glass, and they appear to be chatting.
Okay, let me just see what that is. I'm sorry, that's not William Powell. This is a very interesting movie, and this is why I wrote this book, by the way. A lot of these films you can't see anywhere. This is one of them. This is a movie called By Candlelight, and the man on the right is Paul Lucas.
Ah, okay.
And the woman on the left is Alyssa Landy. Now, this movie was directed by, of all people, James Whale, who directed movies like Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, The Old Dark House. Whale was known as a horror film director. Well, he's known as that today, although he hated that. He made some excellent movies in the 1930s, Universal, and this is By Candlelight. It's a wonderful romantic comedy in the Ernst Lubitsch tradition. And unfortunately, it's not available on DVD, and it's really kind of tough to see unless someone might have a 16-millimeter print of it, or you happen to see it at a film festival or something. I don't believe TCM has aired this movie yet, but it's a movie that really warrants reappraisal.
Yeah, for certain. And I mean, Alyssa Landy is like such a almost like, I mean, to say she's a distant memory is probably an overstatement.
Oh, yeah. I mean, who remembers Alyssa Landy? But she was one of the great beauties of the 1930s. Now, Paul Lucas, people will probably remember him as in movies like Kim with Errol Flynn, Alfred Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes, Strange Cargo with Clark Gable and Joan Crawford. So he worked a lot in America and in Britain.
Yeah, it's now I recognize him. He almost had that William Powell kind of profile, but as I'm focusing, it's clear. No apology, or actually an apology to Mr. Powell. Good night, wherever you are. We'll go to our next picture.
Okay.
And Clark Gable, dressed in black.
Yep, with Norma Shearer. This is from the...
My mother's favorite actress, okay.
Yeah, Norma Shearer was married to to Irving Thalberg, who was head of production at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer.
Right.
So she used to get all the plum roles at MGM, and this is one of Gable's early films. This is before he really became Clark Gable. He plays a gangster in this movie. It's called A Free Soul from 1931. It's directed by Clarence Brown, who is probably one of MGM's best directors. I mean, although he only worked at MGM, he directed such classics as National Velvet and The Human Comedy and many others. But this is one of the best. And there's a great scene where Norma Shearer is falling in love with Gable, who's a real bad guy, and she's lying there in a negligee on a chaise lounge, and she says to Gable, she holds her arms out while she's lying down. She says, "Come on, put him around me." So, her father is played by Lionel Barrymore in that movie, and Lionel Barrymore won an Oscar for Best Actor for the movie, A Free Soul.
And it's amazing. What was Clark Gable's breakout role, in your estimation?
Well, I would say his big breakout role, I mean, at the beginning he was usually playing gangsters in many movies, and he was getting a lot of hype from the studio, and a lot of women were writing to MGM saying, "Oh, I wish he'd beat me up like he did Norma Shearer." Harlow in another great pre-code film, Red Dust.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was his big breakthrough film, definitely. And Jean Harlow's, as a matter of fact.
Very interesting how the whole thing materialized. We'll go to our next picture.
Okay.
And this is I believe we have Mr. Gable again staring at a young lady in a bathtub?
Yes. Okay, that's another Gable film. Now, by this time, Gable was a big star. This was the follow-up film to Red Dust, which I just mentioned. The girl in the tub is Jean Harlow. And this is a movie called Hold Your Man with Gable and Harlow. It was still a big success, although it just wasn't quite as good as Red Dust. This film was directed by Sam Wood, who, in my opinion, was never as good a director as some of the heavyweights. Wood was as good as his scripts, and he always used to surround himself with good technicians working on the film. As a matter of fact, one actor who hated working with him was Groucho Marx.
Now, why was that?
Groucho just didn't think he was a good director. As a matter of fact, there's a classic quip, if I remember it correctly. Groucho was messing up his lines when they were making A Night at the Opera, and Sam Wood looked at Groucho, and he was really upset, and he said, "Well, I guess you can't make an actor out of clay." And Groucho quipped, "Or a director out of wood."
And this from a man who could predict the entire economic landscape with the price of pumpernickel bread.
Yes, exactly.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. We'll go to the next one.
Okay.
And this is a young lady who's laying down. Actually, it's Maureen O'Sullivan, I believe.
You're close, but it's not. And there's a young man, on the right.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
He's on a chaise lounge. Okay, that's one of the most beautiful women in film, in my opinion. That's Frances D. Who was married
very close.
to Joel McCrea. And the young man is Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And this movie is another film that I mentioned a movie before, directed by William Wellman, The Public Enemy. This is one of the lesser-known Wellman films, although it's quite good. It's a good newspaper film called Love is a Racket from 1932. And that's Frances D. in a role with Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was a contract player at Warner Brothers at the time. D. was under contract to Paramount Pictures, but she was being loaned to Warner Brothers for this film.
Now, what was the career trajectory of Frances D.?
Well, I mean, she started in movies as a bit player, and then she became rather big in movies in the around 1932-33. But then she married Joel McCrea, and she had two sons, Jody, and then she had David. Jody, I think, was born in 34, and David was born in 1935. And 20 years later, they had another son together, Peter McCrea, who was a friend of mine, and he's been to our house, and I've shown him a few of his mom's films. But she kind of her career was kind of sporadic. She would stay home and take care of her family, and then she would get a film role and go back and make movies. But she had worked well into the 1950s.
And that was kind of typical in those days, that women would leave film to get married and raise families and maybe show up in a bit part somewhere or some...
Well, I mean, if you're a big star, like Joan Crawford or someone like that, there was a stipulation in your contract where you couldn't have children. So a lot of these women would adopt because they didn't want to lose. The studios didn't want them to lose their figures. But Frances D, I guess having a family was more important. But she sustained her figure. I mean, she looks beautiful in movies like The Gay Deception, which she did after she had her first two sons.
Yeah, it's one of those names that, like, when you sort of take the names from the past and bring them into the present, you almost have to remember her.
Val Lewton film. Val Lewton did a string of horror films, psychological horror films in the 1960s for RKO. And one of her most famous movies is a movie called I Wake Up Screaming.
Yeah, I remember that.
Kind of a schlocky title, but it's very good. And it's kind of has the same plot as Jane Eyre, believe it or not.
Yeah, I do remember that. We'll move to our next picture.
Okay.
And the story of Temple Drake. This looks kind of risque and scary. And
Well, I mean, if any movie was responsible for bringing in the code, it was probably the story of Temple Drake. And the woman on the bed is Miriam Hopkins.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy who's about ready to whatever is a bit player named Jim Mason, not to be confused with James Mason, the British star. This Jim Mason, rather than playing romantic roles, was usually selling guns to the Indians and being West. But this movie was really about a young Southern belle. She's very wealthy. She's kidnapped by a gangster, and he becomes her pimp, and she becomes a prostitute. And she starts enjoying her way of life until she murders her pimp later on because he's always beating her up. And I mean, this was really a sordid tale.
1935.
1933.
1933. Yeah.
1933.
Wow.
It's not been on television that often. I think TCM ran it once, and it still has not made its way to videotape or DVD.
Let me ask you this. I mean, the late 1960s, there was I think if memory serves, it probably was about 1968. There was this rating system for movies. I forget the exact numeration. You know, as far as something going from G to perhaps X. How were films, I guess my real blunt question is, how did they keep children out of these things way back when?
Well, I mean, movies back then were made for all audiences. But sometimes with movies like Babyface or the story of Temple Drake, they would have signs outside, not for children. But, I mean, the movies were filled with double entendres, and kids just wouldn't get it if they went to the movies. I mean, I think parents, you know, actually the Catholic Church, too, used to have lists of movies where everybody could go to the movies. I mean, you probably remember that when you were a kid.
Well, I remember Monsignor Coleman in St. John's saying what you couldn't do.
What movies you could see and what movies were accepted by the Catholic Church, what movies were not. So I think that's what they did, more or less. I mean, a kid going to see a movie like this, I don't think they would allow a child to see the story of Temple Drake.
It's an amazing thing to see. Was this movie in color?
No. No, that picture that you're seeing is a lobby card, and they measured 11 by 14.
Yeah.
And then the black and white stills were 8 by 10. And they used to put those in front of the theaters. You probably remember seeing those as a kid. And they would kind of colorize them. I mean, those aren't actual color photographs.
Right, they would watercolor them. Oh yeah, part of my job way back when at the Stanford Theater was sliding the lobby cards into the little picture sleeves out in the lobby.
Oh, you should have kept them.
So we'll go to the next picture. And how many do we have after this, Mike?
That's the last one.
And this would be the last one. And a very pretty lady in very scanty clothing sitting on a bed. That's all I can...
Okay, the scantily clad young lady is Ginger Rogers. Wow. And the fellow underneath the bed who's hiding from her boyfriend is Eddie Quillen. Now, Eddie Quillen was, he started movies in the silent era with Max Sennett, the comedy producer. And he made a lot of short subjects, and he was a comedian. And this movie is a 1931 film. This is 2 years before Ginger was teamed with Fred Astaire and flying down to Rio in 1933. This is a 1931 film called The Tip-Off. It was a gritty gangster film. And, you know, again, this is what I tried to do in the book, is trying to get you to see these unknown little gems. And this is a wonderful little film. You know, I mean, it's nothing great, but it's fun. It's fun to watch.
Now, Ginger's career, if you're going to say the breakout with her, was it the Busby Berkeley musicals or was it the films with Fred Astaire?
No, it was definitely Flying Down to Rio from 1933. That was released at the end of 33.
Mm-hmm.
And although Ginger and Fred were supporting stars in it, audiences really enjoyed them a lot. So that was her big breakthrough film. I mean, she had worked in movies for years prior to this. I think, she started in 1930. And she had some good parts in movies like 42nd Street and Gold Diggers of 1933. But like I said, her big breakthrough film was Flying Down to Rio. The following year, in 1934, she and Fred starred in their first film, well, their second film together, The Gay Divorcee. And then what followed after that was Top Hat, Swing Time,
right,
and so forth.
And those movies are just so. I mean, Channel 9 in New York used to show them all. I mean, it was. And anytime you saw them, it was like you were seeing them for the first time.
Yeah. Oh, they're wonderful films. I mean, they're among my favorite musicals of all time. I could watch Fred and Ginger all day. As a matter of fact, I'll confess, Ginger Rogers is my favorite actress.
I think you have excellent taste, my friend. Since you've done the book, what have you heard from the readers and for those involved with it?
Well, I mean, the book hasn't been published yet. It's going to be published. It's published on June 5th.
Ah, okay.
I did receive a notification from a woman from England today that she received her copy today in the mail, and she posted it on Facebook. So it looks good. I just haven't received my copies yet. And you could buy it through the publisher, Bear Manor, or you can get it on Amazon. It's called Sex in the Cinema, the pre-code years, 1929 to 1934. And people might balk and say, well, gee, the pre-code era was 1930 to 34. That's true. But I cover before that because, you know, anything before that was pre-code, before the code came in. And I do cover a couple movies from 1929. The book is available in Kindle, on Kindle for, I think it's $9.95.
Great.
You get the hard-bound copy for $35, and there is going to be a soft-bound copy for $25. And it's going to be published, as I said, next Monday, June 5th. Sex in the Cinema by Lou Sabini.
And the author Lou Sabini, the friend of Tony De Angelo and Going the Other Way. The book, Sex in the Cinema. Lou, thank you so much for taking this time with us. I really do appreciate it. And
I could have talked to you for hours, and I wish we could do it again. We could have gone through 50 pictures.
You know, we have to do that. We have to just get a stack of pictures and throw them on the screen, and we'll just have a good old time.
Okay, that'll be great.
Okay, listen, take care. Best to Sue.
Okay, thanks.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
And that was Lou Sabini on his new book, Sex in the Cinema, published by Bear Manor Publishing. We're going to be coming right back and winding out here on Tony De Angelo's PM Coast to Coast and Mike Du Bois' favorite moment of the show.
It's not the pale moon